A very good evening. Thank you everyone for joining. On behalf of Teach 613 and our Shmiras Halashon program, To Think Before We Speak, we welcome you to our not so late Shmiras Halashon program. Right? 8 o'clock versus 9:30. That brings a smile. Thank you very much to our hostess, to our coordinators, to our participants, to all the smiling faces that join on this cold winter evening. I came across a very interesting article. There's a publication called Zman, which you may have come across, which seems to be geared primarily to teen boys. The articles are just as the example that I'd like to glean something from. A Secret Service agent article with all people that you wouldn't know that they're Secret Service agents because they're all just well dressed with sunglasses, but somehow the Secret Service agent splashed across the front has a certain appeal to it, especially to the boyish teen. There's an article there about a firm gentleman who's in charge of the communications department of the Secret Service and how he has to figure out before every event which frequencies he's going to block and which frequencies he's going to keep active, because he doesn't want anybody communicating the location of the president, for example, to anybody else while they're in the room, and he doesn't want anybody that's not supposed to be communicating. Wants to have everything secure. So he has jammed what he wants to jam. And of course, he doesn't want to jam everything because then his own staff can't communicate. So I was thinking to myself in the context of Shmiras Halashon and in the discussion that I'd like to take tonight from the Mesilas Yesharim, that this is exactly what we're looking to do. They say that the Chafetz Chaim was a very talkative person. It wasn't like he was advocating that everybody should just keep their mouth shut. That's our expression. Just keep your mouth shut. But it's not true. It's really what our slogan was developed as, to think before you speak. You're going to speak. You're going to speak plenty. You're a talkative person, not a problem. But we want to make sure to jam the right frequencies. We want to make sure that the right frequencies are active, and when you start detecting an unacceptable, unauthorized cell phone use in the auditorium, as he describes it, he could identify its source within seconds, and he sends people over to escort the person out, because he's able to identify the unauthorized use of communication. And that's what we're looking at. The Mesilas Yesharim in tonight's session is going to point out that even though we tend to think things are either permitted or forbidden, but in reality we're supposed to construct a siyag, a fence, around the observance, so that not only is the actual totally forbidden item not being violated, not being done, but we also can detect whenever we're coming even close to it. Our antennas go up, warning signs. We don't wait till someone does the wrong thing. We could tell, for example, when a conversation is veering off in the wrong direction. Right? It's almost like a contest. How many people can we bury during this conversation when it starts veering off in the wrong direction? Not only that person, but the next person. It becomes very negative. And your antennas go up, and you're able to detect it, and you're able to hopefully veer in a different direction. On a positive note, the same way that there's certain neutral forms of speech that we already detect we'd rather steer clear from, there are also neutral forms of speech that are 100% mitzvahs. And that's the comment that I love to quote of a friend of mine who memorized the Guinness Book of World Records, and whenever the conversation veers off in the wrong direction, He would say, do you know that in Australia there's somebody who took seashells and built a model of the White House? Why ever would they do that in Australia? Must have had a cousin or somebody from America. And suddenly he's just blown the conversation up into a more intellectually stimulating and kosher type of conversation. I would say that even though I don't envy him to memorize his Guinness Book of, but he's on to something. And that's a mitzvah. Le mitzvah yechashev. Let it be considered a mitzvah because he's using a neutral application for a mitzvah purpose. So the topic that I want to discuss is taken from Perek Yud Gimel, chapter 13 of Mesilas Yesharim. If you're in the traditional text, the common text that's Feldheim's original, it's page 180. And the topic which he's discussing is that even of what is permitted, there is plenty that we're supposed to purposely choose either to sanctify it or to veer away from it, but that there is plenty in the neutral category that we are consciously deciding how to handle and what to do with it. This is the topic called Pirishus, which means separation. Just to jump ahead of ourselves, he gives examples. Food. Either it's kosher or it's not kosher, right? That's where it ends. Wrong. You could have somebody who's taking lots of kosher food, but he's eating to the point that it is truly negative. You could drink enough wine that there's nothing to talk to. Hands down, it may have been kosher, but it's not kosher. And the same thing with a type of meal, stuff your face, or whatever else. It ends up being not kosher. It's not acceptable. He mentions clothing. Person should definitely make an effort to be dignified, and we behave differently when we dress dignified and we realize that we're children of Hashem. But if a person starts wearing haughty clothing, at some point it becomes forbidden. My wife was joking with me that if you follow all the ads for clothing from head to toe, a person walks into the room, including shaitel, jewelry, etc. It's $500,000. What's going on? You have to know at what point is it batamt, and at what point, even though it's kosher, it's not so kosher anymore. We've crossed the threshold of perspective. And the same thing could be applied to every area, including speech. It was all kosher, but was it? And he starts off by outlining two very different perspectives, which he's going to try to resolve. One perspective is, if Chazal wanted it to be forbidden, or if the Torah wanted it to be forbidden, it would have been forbidden. Why would we come ahead and say, on perfectly legitimate behavior, better not? Better not. Why would you do that? Professor Aaron Tversky, loves to recount how on one occasion he was invited to sit on a certain committee, and for whatever reason he had his doubts whether this law committee is a place where a nice Jewish boy belongs. So he called his Rosh Hashiva, and he asked him, should I do it? Should I not do it? Rosh Hashiva said, I'd like to think about it. He did some research. They speak again, and his Rosh Hashiva tells him, as he loves to quote, it's mutter. You're allowed to do it. But who says you have to do everything that's permitted? And you have to know when to apply that. But the initial response of the Mesilas Yesharim is, if it's not forbidden, so why shouldn't I do it? Right? If it's allowed, it's allowed. Why should I restrain myself? That's one perspective. Second perspective is that we do find a person's supposed to be Kedoshim Tihiyu. You should be holy. You should be separate from certain behaviors. Even though it's permitted, it's not for you. Rabbi A.J. Twersky. We're on a Twersky addiction tonight. Does he have 12 steps if you get on a Twersky addiction? Rabbi A.J. Twersky loves to recount how his father gave him musar. When his father wanted to tell him not to do it, he said, "Is past nicht. It's not befitting you." Which is genius. Because on the one hand, when you give rebuke, you're trying to tell them not to do it, and it's a bad behavior. On the other hand, the more you give a person rebuke, the more you're lowering their ability of self-confidence to have the wherewithal to live up to your expectations. But when you say, you're better than that, so then you've lifted the person at the same time, and you've lowered the behavior in their eyes so that they're able to live up to your expectations. So, on one occasion, his father found out that he had been playing chess on Rosh Hashanah afternoon. Now, are you allowed to play chess on Rosh Hashanah afternoon?
Yeah.
Welcome, welcome. You've made a lot of people happy.
Wow.
Are you allowed to play chess on Rosh Hashanah afternoon? I ask you.
Probably not breaking any laws.
Honored assembly.
Yes.
Yeah, permitted. Technically permitted. Yeah? He called him into his study, and he told him nothing doing. Es passt nicht. It's not befitting you on Rosh Hashanah to be playing chess in the afternoon. It's a powerful message that there are things that are permitted. I think sometimes it's like the most inspirational aspect where a person says, I'm allowed to do it, and if someone else does it, I'm not going to look down on them, but I feel that I've grown beyond that, and I don't think I should be doing that. And depending on what the topic is, there's something very positive about choosing your life's direction based on this idea, because it's negativity free. It's not being negative about the people around you, looking down on them. It's not being negative to me if I don't live up to it. It's not a rebuke style growth. It's a positive growth. I'm not holding where I used to be holding, and I don't think that's a form of recreation that's appropriate for me. A type of speech that's befitting me. Comes to mind another story that I heard from a Rebbe, Reb Mordechai Finkelman, Arachayim in Queens, described how as a kid he was in a certain yeshiva, shall remain nameless, where the cook used to scream. But she screamed. If you didn't take the portion the way you were supposed to, or you entered the kitchen when you weren't supposed to, she screamed. Seems like she has a temper. He came back a few years later, and he was observing lunchtime, and he sees she's calm, cool, and collected. And he can't figure out. Nothing frazzles her. So after everything quieted down, he was curious. He walked over to her, and after making some small talk, he says, you know, things around here seem to be much calmer than when I was in yeshiva. Just seeing if she would take the bait. And she took it. She says, yeah, I don't scream anymore. Says, oh. She says, yeah. One time I was by my sister's house, and my kid ran out without a coat. I guess it was January. Kid ran out without a coat. And my sister has a full-length mirror next to the front door. And as he ran out, I started screaming at him the way I used to scream. And as I screamed at him, I saw myself in the mirror. And her words were, and I looked like a dog. And I resolved never to do that again. Now, he didn't give us her secret after the resolve, how she managed to change. You could sell that secret for a pretty penny. But the resolve, that's big. Is it permitted to scream? Yeah, I don't know. We could discuss it separately. But let's say it's permitted. You know, sometimes you hear arguments between husband and wife, and you think, oh no, where's the shalom bayis? And then you find that's the way they talk. That's the way they talk. I'm not saying it's right. I think there's a softer, nicer way to communicate. But that, in their perspective, that's the way they talk. No harm intended. Mr. Hines, the prosecutor in New York, so I once heard a lecture from him. He said one of his first days on the job, there were two Jewish litigants, and the judge went sidebar, and the two of them, they're screaming and yelling, and one of his colleagues was ready to call the police. He says, you know, notify court security to come in. I mean, this is one step before fist fights. And Mr. Hines said, no, that's the way they talk. Hands flying and screaming. He says, don't worry, they'll never hit each other. Don't worry. It's permitted. If that's the way you talk, that's the base medrash. Unless someone's getting insulted, it could be it's forbidden at some point. Maybe it's permitted. But to explore cases where it is permitted, but it might not be appropriate, might not be right for us to do. So let's begin with the text. I'm on the second page, page 180, second page of the chapter. If you're in a different edition, it's simply the third paragraph of chapter 13. V'im tomar, one might ask. He writes as follows. Anyway, who doesn't have a text, you're welcome, invited. This is the text. It comes even if you don't want to buy the full-size edition. If your eyes can still handle, you could buy the pocket edition. And you have the text. It's nice to have it. V'im tomar, he asks. Minayin lanu liyos mosifim v'holchim bo'isurim. How do you know that there's such a concept of adding to the prohibitions? How do you know there's such a concept? In other words, Hashem made 613 mitzvahs. This is what we should do. This is what we should not do. And now you're throwing into the mix the concept that I might want to add a protective measure. I might say that for me, it's not right for me to do that. And you're going to deprive yourself of some sort of joy or some sort of freedom that you're objecting to. Now, keep in mind that if you follow our approach of personal pride, you're not depriving yourself of anything. On the contrary, you're just deciding not to play in the mud. So you're depriving yourself of playing in the mud and the joy of throwing mud at somebody else, but it's not taking away from you because the enormous pride simply overrides that trivial pleasure. But nevertheless, there is this concept of, I'm depriving myself of something. He says, Harei Chachamenu Zal Amru, our rabbi said regarding the Nazarite, the Nazir, who deprives himself of wine based on a vow, Lo daicha ma'aseh asur Torah, it's not enough what was prohibited from the Torah, you're adding to the prohibitions. He says, Masharo Chachamenu, whatever the rabbis decided to prohibit, they prohibited. Why are you adding to that? Now, there's also a slightly aside observation over here. In terms of Jewish literature, it seems to me that the most discussed topics in Jewish law are not biblical ones, but rather rabbinic ones. If you think about it, it's quite obvious. Let's take kosher. What's the prohibition of milk and meat?
Not to eat it together.
Not to
Not
eat?
cook it together.
Ooh, thank you, scholars. Good. What was that?
That's getting benefit.
If milk and meat, not even chicken, meat, milk and meat were cooked together, then it's prohibited to eat, it was prohibited to do it, and it's prohibited to benefit from it. Yeah? How much real estate, so to speak, how much time do we spend on discussing milk and meat that were cooked together? Not a whole lot. The biblical law, it's there, we avoid it. That's not really where our big discussions are. Where are our big discussions? On rabbinics. On rabbinic safeguards. Not even to cook chicken together, not even to mix them when you're not cooking them, not even to eat them within hours of each other. All kinds of things that have nothing to do with the classic biblical thing. Why is there so much discussion about that? Right? We have different tablecloths. Why so much discussion? Because the rabbis only imposed rabbinics and only imposed customs and everything else to the extent that they felt it necessary. And as soon as they felt it's not necessary anymore, you'll find that, wouldn't it be easier to just, no milk and meat on the same shelf, no milk and meat in the same house. But the rabbi said that's not necessary. We're going only as far as is necessary. Same shelf you're allowed to do. As long as it's in storage. You're in the middle of eating. You can't, on the same table as you're eating, there are restrictions. 2 people, 1 person eating fleishik, 1 person eating milchik. There has to be a demarcation. But once you put up the demarcation, it's fine. If one of them is eating on a tray, no problem. Why can't you just say, no milk and meat on the same table, not even the same room? Because they're not coming to make a new religion. They're looking to safeguard what's existing. And only as far. Same thing with Eruv. How do the rabbinic laws work? There's a whole masechta called Eruvin. Because you're not allowed to carry outside, but if you make a demarcation that looks like a door frame, it has an upright, it has a crossbeam, it has another upright, it becomes permitted. That's how rabbinics work. They say something's prohibited, but only prohibited to the extent that it's necessary to uphold Torah law. So Rabbi Luzzatto was saying, the rabbis were already here. Like the whole religion is graffitied. Rabbis were here. They took care of all the safeguards. What are you coming to make a new safeguard? And they were so precise in the safeguards. So you're coming and you're doing more? You're going to tell me something that's permitted is forbidden? You're going to avoid, for what? That's perspective number one. A person is going to give a din lifnei hamakom, he writes, on anything that you saw was permitted and you chose not to enjoy. Even though it's part of Hashem's creation, you're going to have to give a judgment. Why not? Why didn't you enjoy it? Mentioned on Shabbos, we gave the shir because of upcoming Tu B'Shvat. On Shabbos, this coming Shabbos, so there's a Mishnah Berurah that writes that whenever you see something tasty in creation, the Yerushalmi says you should try to partake of it, even if it's just a little bit. Taste it, savor it. Hashem created it. Enjoy it. It's a far cry from Pirishus, from separation, from warding off things that are permitted in my life. It seems that we're supposed to engage and enjoy and not prohibit anything extra. In contrast to that, he writes, it says, Kedoshim Tiryu, you're supposed to be sanctified, you're supposed to be holy, you're supposed to prohibit certain things that are otherwise permitted. They describe about Chizkiah Melech Yehuda that he had exactly what he needed. He was a king, but he ate what he needed to. Tzaddik ochel l'sova nafsho, he eats the right amount and not more. And which way is it supposed to go? Are we supposed to be separating ourselves? Are we supposed to be engaging in everything that's permitted? He writes, "Tzirichim anu l'taretz." We need to give an answer. And his answer very simply is that a person definitely needs boundaries. But those boundaries have to be drawn based on a perspective. What is the perspective that we go through life with? We're looking to serve Hashem. There will be things that are permitted, but for certain people are simply not necessary in order to serve Hashem. And if they're not necessary, and they're distractions, then that's what they are. Some people need certain types of vacations, and some people don't. There's no universal law, and therefore the rabbis could not legislate that certain type of vacation is too much. Too much for who? It's not universal, and it's going to depend on the person. There's certain types of chitter-chatter that are necessary for some people, not necessary for others. This is the credo that you walk around with. I am in this world to serve Hashem. We all know you walk into a room and you feel like an outsider. You're coming in for the first time, and someone engages you in chitter-chatter. Nothing talk. You ask afterwards, what did they say? You don't even know what we spoke about the weather. That chitter-chatter is a mitzvah among the highest leveled mitzvahs, because the unscripted dialogue was, welcome to our group. How was your ride? Can I take your coat? How was the weather for you? Are you cold? No. Empty chatter. Doesn't do anything for anyone, right? Wrong. Afterwards, can you remember what the conversation was? No. But I felt like someone cared about me. That's 1,000,000,000% mitzvah. And then you can have people who are shooting the breeze, and you start wondering, and what do they do for life? You can't mandate Yes, no, sitting on a beach chair. Well, I could if it's this cold outside. But if you're in a locale and a time of year, sitting on a beach chair with iced tea, yes or no? It depends. If right now you need that relaxed time, or you're schmoozing with somebody and it's correct, fine. It's more than fine. It's a mitzvah. And if not, the expression is, it's prikas ol. It's removing the responsibility of being a servant of Hashem from your shoulders. You've entered your own little world. And it's not servicing what Hashem put you here for. A businessman told me that he was in Toronto a few years ago. I don't know if you could trace which wonderful restaurant, but it seemed to be a very good restaurant. His business partners told him they'd like to go out to eat, and he says, "This has to be kosher, otherwise I can't eat." So they found a place, good restaurant. And he went, and it really was good. Ooh, it was good. The wine, the food, it was good. He's coming out stuffed. Forgive me, barely walk. And his comment was, if my wife in New York ever knew that I did this. So they look at him and say, I don't understand. I thought it was kosher. I thought we took you to a kosher place. And it was so confusing because it was a kosher place, but it wasn't kosher. At least not the way these particular clients let it go out of hand and just kept ordering and ordering and eating and stuffing and eating and stuffing. And this particular businessman sensed, as he walked out, that he would never do a repeat performance for the rest of his life. Because he realized it's kosher, but it's not kosher. It was not proper behavior, not dignified behavior. How do you explain that to the clients who went out of their way to take him to a kosher place? I thought it's kosher. It is kosher, but it's not kosher. And sometimes you wonder in Shmiras HaLashon, I didn't say anything wrong, did I? And sometimes people say, well, I'm talking about a person, it's a mitzvah to talk Lashon Hara about him. And you get the feeling that you just like, it's the wrong tone. And that's what he's describing over here. That a person is supposed to be focused, motivated to develop the personality in the direction that truly leaves them feeling that they're serving Hashem properly. Let's pause for questions.
In the restaurant, how could he be responsible for other people's behavior? Maybe they have different needs than he does.
That's true, but he obviously sensed that it was not appropriate for him. Now, this is a very interesting thing if you want to delve into it, because sometimes the only way you realize that you've progressed to a new level is by, so to speak, violating your own standard and then realizing. And then you come to that conclusion. I had a Rebbe who described how in his yeshiva on Shavuos, there was one group, Shavuos afternoon, who would dance for hours. They were dancing. It was like Simchas Torah HaKafas. And another group who would sit and learn in the Beis Medrash. Shavuos, we got the Torah. So for years he was part of the dancers. And one year he went over to Rosh Hashiva and said, For years I've been part of the dancers, and this year I really feel, I feel totally guilty. I feel like my time was not well spent. I danced with great fervor, but I was jealous of the people in the Beis Medrash because they were learning. And what could be better on a day like Shavuos to actually be learning Torah? And the Rosh Hashiva told him, you're developing. If that's what you sense, then that's what you should follow next year. If you feel you belong in the Beis Medrash, then that's what your neshama needs. That's what you are missing. Now, far be it from me to say one is greater or holier than the other, but you don't really realize that you've progressed until you do it and you continue doing it, and then you sense, I'm beyond this. I don't belong here. Now, there may have been people in the group who needed the expression, stuff your face. But this gentleman, after doing it once, realized he had gone overboard, realized it was not appropriate for him. I'm a prince of Hashem. You eat. You splurge a little bit sometimes. It's a treat. You don't stuff your face. I happen to have an affinity to that expression, if you haven't noticed. Because on my first Chavrusa program, we used to go into Rutgers, East Brunswick, to learn with students. And on the way in, on Route 18, there was a store on the side of the road that was called Stuff Your Face. And us yeshiva boys, this was our exposure to the outside world, and we would pass Stuff Your Face, and some guy on the van, you know, whoever the shliach tzibur for the night was, would call out, "Stuff your face!" and this was our preparation that we were going to share Torah values with the students on campus. So I have a certain, you know, clash of cultures identified with that expression. So you'll forgive me if I use it. But yes, it's permitted, it's kosher, it's 100% kosher. What do you want from me? But it doesn't behoove you. And sometimes, like I'm saying, you might have to actually do this violation that's not really a violation. It's just it doesn't behoove you. You have to do it before you realize that it's not for you. Could be. So I don't think it should be guilt-ridden, because technically it's permitted. But a person has to be paying attention, because you might be above that. And if you are, take it as a compliment. Yeah.
Oh, no, I'm sorry. I was just my...
No problem. I know a guy who on Simchas Torah, when they auctioned things off, he kept adjusting his hat. And without knowing it, he was bidding. His father had to cover for him. The bill was a big one. Anyway.
If you're above the activity and you're doing it anyway, you get held against you.
I don't like to think about it as held against you. I think that you're limiting your potential, though. Imagine anybody, craftsman of any type, and they just refuse to graduate. And you could have a potentially great artisan who's still making pottery stage 1. You know, like pottery stage 1 is great, and it has its place, and it's a craft out there, you know. But if he's an artisan, at some point, he wants to improve his skill. And if he refuses to improve his skill, so then that's wasted talent. Comments, questions? Yeah.
In the story, when the guy said, yes, it was kosher, but it wasn't kosher. And they said, what do you mean? How did he explain that without insulting anyone.
He told me he couldn't. He told me he just let it fly. He told me he couldn't do it. He realized like they went out of their way to take to a kosher place, and he was able to participate. But he realized that it wasn't correct. I don't think everything can be explained. I guess maybe if you really make it down to earth, you just say, I think I overate. That's kind of universal. Okay, let's spend a few moments on the handout. Based on the Chafetz Chaim, I wanted to review the conditions of constructive Lashon Hara. Again, I know we've done this 1,000,000,000 times, but we always have some participant comment, observation, an insight, something good comes of it, and to develop one of the themes in particular. Number one, you have to contemplate if it's really bad. And we know different cultures, different attitudes. It's not always clear that it's definitely bad. And sometimes if you're not sure if it's bad, you might have to just relate the information in a very neutral tone because you're not sure, right? The example I always give is people coming on time. Everybody has a different definition of on time. We even have our own little joke of Jewish time. That's 5 to 10 minutes later than everyone else, whether that's true or it's just a personal joke. But we know that. Some people are sitting there at the stroke of 5:30 and they want to know why you're not in your seat. And some people, 5:30 means that's when I leave my house. And I'll get there when I get there. I noticed I'm teaching in a yeshiva now this year. So class starts, the bell rings, and this type of stuff. You know, what does that mean? It's 9:40. Is that the time we stop playing football? Is that the time we're supposed to be in our desks, sitting by our desk? What exactly does that mean? And if a person doesn't do what your perception is, so the Chafetz Chaim says, but you have to be open to a different person's perception. That doesn't mean he's bad. Number two, you're never allowed to make it worse than it is. You can't say he always comes late or he always exaggerates. How many times did he exaggerate? You have to be careful not to make something worse than it. He steals. If the guy is a smooth talk, used car salesman, I'm not saying I agree with his tactics, but you can't call him a grand larceny thief. He's using all legitimate tactics very carefully, never to overstep his bounds into legalities, but you ask him about the car, he tells you, well, the horn makes noise. So does the muffler. The horn makes noise. You have to be careful with not making it worse than it is. Number three, intended for the benefit, not out of hatred. Not good for you, not good for them, not good for anyone, for you to think, I was hurt by them, now is my chance, I'm going to bury them. And I'll say the Lashon Hara, if it's done out of hatred, nothing good will come from it. Number four, if possible, accomplish the same protection in a different way. Let's say you really know this guy's a swindler, but instead of telling them that he's a swindler, you could steer them to a different service provider. So do that. What do you need it for? And number five, be aware that the result is supposed to be withholding of a benefit from the person you're speaking against, but you're not supposed to be damaging them. If you're damaging them, it has to really be within the framework of what the court would award. And we gave the example, if you're angry with the storekeeper, not allowed to smash his window. You can protectively avoid him from getting customers that he's going to damage, because in your perception, he's damaging his customers and he's not being honest. But you don't have a right to start doing damages to him. Paragraph 10. If you see someone walking into a store to purchase merchandise, and you know the person is naive, and you know that the storekeeper is known to take advantage of such customers, you must tell the prospective customer the nature of this store, even if they have already decided the purchase price, meaning it's ready to go through. But if you know that this person smooth talks products, you walked in, you never needed, you end up buying them, and the person walking in is naive, is susceptible to this, and won't see through it, then you notify them. Certainly, if you actually know that he's been taken advantage of, you have to tell them. For example, you see that he's smooth talking him into what he claims is a very reputable brand. You don't know vacuum cleaners, and you walk in, and he tells you, yeah, for $165, you could get top of the line. A naive person asks, so why are the other ones $465? And he says, oh, that's nothing. That's just, little gadgets and unnecessary things. $165, I'll get you best top of the line. So the point here is, even though he's not stealing, he's not charging improperly, he's giving the person a vacuum cleaner that matches the price that he's paying. But he smooth talked the person into a purchase that the person didn't want. The rule would be similar if he's taking advantage of the customer in amount, weight, or price. In all of these cases, you must tell the prospective customer, but you have to observe the conditions which were outlined previously. I think what becomes clear over here is that Lashon Hara requires that we know the difference between right and wrong. And we know what games in business you're allowed to play, in order that we should know whether we're allowed to talk. Look at the notes. He says it's a reputable brand, and you know it's not true, even if the price that he's charging is appropriate. That was my example in the vacuum cleaner. But the customer did not want to acquire this merchandise. Certainly, if it isn't worth the amount he's charging, then you tell, because then it's cheating. Amount, weight, or price. For example, if the item is worth 5 coins, he's charging 6. If the overcharge is less than a sixth, then there's a certain range, an allowance, and it's difficult to know whether you're supposed to be talking or not. But if it's above that range of tolerance, then certainly you're supposed to notify the person. This becomes very challenging to a storekeeper, by the way. Just honest dealings. He has a product that he really would like to sell, and he's having trouble selling. He made a calculation that he thinks he can sell 100 of them. He bought 100 of them, and they're not selling. So a naive customer comes in. He's not going to cheat him. Not going to charge him $400 for a product that's $165. But he is going to smooth talk the person into thinking something that he, the storekeeper today, does not believe is true. I do not believe that the 165 vacuum cleaner services you the same way that the 465 does. But I have 98 to sell. So I'm going to tell you that it does. And if you're naive enough to believe me, business is business. And that's not clear at all, that you're allowed to do that. There's a certain amount of trust the person is putting in you. Yes, a storekeeper is going to smooth talk a certain amount, but he's trusting you to a certain amount. And in that case, certainly the bystander has the right and the obligation to say, I really think you do better with the higher priced, higher quality product, because that's really what's best for the customer. Assuming they can afford it, and assuming they were willing to do it, you have to always be on the lookout for that person who is potentially going to be damaged. Okay, any other questions? Yesher koach, thank you very much for joining.